What is fermentation? In this video, I'm going to give a breakdown of the fermentation process. We'll explore how tiny microorganisms transform simple ingredients like vegetables into flavorful delights like pickles, sauerkraut, and kombucha. Fermentation is a metabolic process that involves the conversion of sugars into compounds like alcohols and organic acids by microorganisms like bacteria, yeast, and mold. Now, if that statement sounded so scientific and so complicated, don't worry, I got you, I'm here for you. I will break it down for you. So let's rewind a bit and touch on the concept of metabolism. Like we said, fermentation is a metabolic process. So what is a metabolic process? A metabolic process is any process, any chemical process specifically, that occurs within a living organism with the purpose of maintaining its life. Now within our bodies, we have these little tiny things that are called cells. And these cells are constantly working to keep us alive. Now these cells need energy. Energy is the most important element that we need to stay alive, because we need the energy to move, to grow, to think, to get out of bed, although there's not enough energy to get out of bed in the morning, am I right? So where does this energy come from? Every living organism on the planet, whether it's a plant or a baby or a virus, uses glucose as a primary source of energy. So to avoid complicating this video, let's use the analogy of a car. Most of our cells are like a hybrid car. A hybrid car uses petrol as fuel, but it can also use electricity if it doesn't have any petrol. In the same way, the cells in our bodies rely on glucose as a primary source of energy. But they can also use other sources like protein and fats in the absence of glucose to make energy. So what is glucose? Glucose is a sugar that the body gets from the food that we eat. The food that we take in is digested, and then the nutrients are absorbed into the body to make energy. The body takes the glucose from the food that we eat and turns it into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ATP is like the cell currency. It's the money that cells will use to transact their businesses, and their business being performing their functions. So ATP is the energy that the cells will use to maintain their functions. The process of making ATP from glucose happens over 3 different stages, sort of like how you go to the airport, check in your bags, verify your documents, and pass through security before you can board the plane. Now for this video, I won't dive into the specifics of those 3 processes because it will take up a lot of time. And quite frankly, it involves a significant number of structures which will elicit some few tears and regret. In fact, I won't even mention the other 2 steps. I will only briefly explain the first one, which is glycolysis. Glycolysis is the first step in the process of creating energy. In this first step, glucose, which is a 6-carbon sugar, is cut down in half. So we start with 6 carbons and we end up with 2 molecules that have 3 carbons each. And this process happens over 10 steps, which again, I won't get into. The overall thing that we need to understand at this point is that we start with glucose, which has 6 carbons, and we end up with a molecule that has 3 carbons, 2 molecules that have 3 carbons. The molecule that we end up with is called pyruvate. And this is the molecule that will proceed to the second checkpoint. The fate of pyruvate in the cell will depend on whether the cell has access to oxygen or not. So remember earlier we said that the process of generating ATP, which is energy, from glucose is like the airport check-in process. We have to go one step at a time. So the first step is glycolysis. We already have our bags checked. Our luggage is fine. It's not over the weight limit. Now the second step is where we check our boarding passes. Now the travelers that have a boarding pass can proceed to the next step. And those that don't have a boarding pass must find an alternative way of getting on the plane. So in this situation, the boarding pass is oxygen. In cells that have oxygen, they can do aerobic respiration. That is, they can break down this pyruvate into energy using oxygen. That is the meaning of aerobic, in the presence of oxygen. The cells that do not have oxygen must find an alternative way of making energy. And this alternative route is called anaerobic respiration. That means the creation of energy that takes place in the absence of oxygen. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And this is what we mean when we talk about fermentation. There are several classes of fermentation depending on the end product during the process. The first type is lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation takes place in certain bacteria like lactobacillus. During lactic acid fermentation, pyruvate is reduced to form lactic acid. Lactic acid fermentation is how we get products like yogurt, which we get from milk. It is also how we make other foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, fermented vegetables, porridge, which Kenyans called uji, and injera, which is an Ethiopian delicacy. Lactic acid fermentation can also be used in secondary processes, such as in the fermentation of kienyeji vegetables. These are traditional vegetables that are too bitter to eat when they are fresh, so instead they are fermented in milk over a period of time, and the bacteria breaks down the vegetable such that at the end of it, they are more palatable, they are sweeter to eat, they don't taste bitter anymore. The second type of fermentation is alcohol fermentation. Now this one is this is probably everyone's favorite type of fermentation. That is, unless you cannot digest alcohol, which is too bad. Alcohol fermentation relies on yeast and some bacteria. It produces ethanol and carbon dioxide, CO2. And CO2 are the bubbles that we tend to see on beer and champagne glasses. The third type of fermentation, which is probably my favorite, I think I like alcohol, no. Lactic acid fermentation is pretty, no. I can't decide. Comment down below and tell me which one is your personal favorite type of fermentation based on the type of food that you like to eat. Now, let's get back to acetic acid fermentation. It is the process that we get vinegar and things like kombucha. Kombucha, my God. Acetic acid fermentation is a two-step process. In the first step, we have yeast fermentation, which we previously talked about, the alcohol fermentation, where yeast takes the pyruvate, breaks it down to ethanol and CO2. And now we go through a second step, which in this case uses oxygen. Now the fourth type of fermentation, which is not very popular, is called butyric acid fermentation. This one occurs mainly in tobacco processing, making of leather. It also happens in the human colon, where the fiber in the food that we eat undergoes fermentation. So the fruits, the vegetables that we eat, we really can't absorb them in that format. What our body does is that it relies on these bacteria that are found in our colon to break down this fiber into butyric acid that our body can now use. So for this one, the pyruvate is oxidized to form acetyl-CoA, which is then reduced to butyric acid. Why should you eat fermented foods? Fermented foods can help you maintain a healthy gut because, as we said earlier, butyric acid fermentation happens in the human colon, and it's really important for digesting food and retrieving the very important nutrients from the food that we consume. The process of fermentation can break down certain foods and make them easy to digest. It can also improve the flavor. Remember we talked about the kienyeji veggies and how fermentation helps to take out the bitterness. There are so many other benefits, such as improving mental health, because your gut and your brain communicate, and I am so excited to talk about this in an upcoming video. Anti-cancer benefits, improving immunity. Like, there's literally so many benefits that come from eating fermented foods, so it will be a good idea to incorporate them into your diet. If you like this video, then feel free to like, comment and subscribe. Leave a comment down below and tell me which one of these fermentation types is your favorite, because personally I cannot make up my mind. I will be doing a deep dive into fermentation over the next few videos and sharing recipes for the different types of fermented foods that are so easy to make and that you can incorporate into your diet. So make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you won't miss any of the uploads. I'll see you on the next one.